Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to your third online lecture in the neuroanatomy module for dentist students. We will discuss today the external features of the medulla oblongata. So this is the anterior surface of the medulla oblongata. This is the anterior view. And the second one is the lateral view of the medulla oblongata. Next slide, we will see the posterior surface of the medulla oblongata. The anterior surface or the anterior features of the medulla, as you can see, is divided into two identical parts by means of this fissure. This fissure is called anterior median fissure. As you can see, in the middle half of this anterior median fissure, it is obliterated here. This is because the pyramidal tract, which descends from above, crosses to the opposite side in this decussation. So this decussation is called pyramidal decussation. So the anterior median fissure is obliterated in the middle by pyramidal decussation. Next to the anterior median fissure, as you can see, this structure is called the pyramid. So this structure is the pyramid. The pyramid of the medulla oblongata includes the pyramidal tract, which descends from above the brain to the midbrain, and then to the pons, and then to the medulla oblongata. When it reaches the medulla oblongata, it passes through this structure, which is the pyramid. And then fibers of this corticospinal tract crosses to the opposite side in the pyramidal decussation, as we mentioned before. Next to the pyramid, this structure here is called the olive. So this small structure on both sides is called olive. So anterior median fissure, pyramid, and olive. The pyramid is separated from the olive by a fissure. This fissure is called anterolateral fissure. So this fissure in the orange line, the orange color, is called the anterolateral sulcus or the anterolateral fissure. And behind the olive, another fissure separates the olive from the inferior cerebellar peduncle. This sulcus is called the posterolateral fissure. If we want to see the anterolateral and the posterolateral fissure, obviously, so we can rotate the medulla to the lateral surface. So this is the olive. This structure here is the olive. And the olive is surrounded by these two fissures, the anterolateral fissure and the posterolateral fissure. The anterolateral fissure, this one is the anterolateral fissure between the olive and the pyramid, and the posterolateral fissure behind the olive, between the olive and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. As we mentioned before, the hypoglossal nerve emerges from the anterolateral fissure. So this is the anterolateral fissure, and this is where the hypoglossal nerve emerges from the medulla oblongata. In the posterolateral fissure, the other three cranial nerves emerges. They are the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve, and the accessory nerve. So they are arranged from above downward. The glossopharyngeal is the first one, then the vagus, then the accessory nerve emerges, the last one. So the olive is surrounded by two fissures. Anterolateral fissure, the anterolateral fissure separates the olive from the pyramid, and the hypoglossal nerve emerges at this sulcus, and the posterolateral sulcus, in which the glossopharyngeal, vagus, and accessory nerves are emerging on the posterolateral sulcus, which separates the olive from the inferior cerebellar peduncle. This is the posterior view of the medulla oblongata. As we mentioned before, the posterior surface of the pons and the posterior surface of the upper part of the medulla are sharing in the formation of the floor of the fourth ventricle. So we have a stria here called medullary stria. These fibers separates the upper part of pons and the upper part of the floor of the fourth ventricle. This part is the back of pons, and the lower part of the floor of the fourth ventricle, which is this part, this is formed by the open medulla. So the open medulla, or the upper part of the posterior surface of the medulla oblongata, is sharing in the floor of the fourth ventricle. The lower part of the medulla, we call it the closed medulla because it is a closed cylindrical surface, and it closes around the central canal or the spinal canal, which continues downward in the spinal cord. Here in the floor of the medulla oblongata, we can find a depression. This depression is called inferior fovea. We will discuss this again when we discuss the fourth ventricle. The inferior fovea, which is this black depression in the floor of the medulla, around this inferior fovea, you can find the three cranial nerves which are emerging from the medulla oblongata. The vagal trigone is the depression between the two limbs of the inferior fovea. Medial to the vagal trigone is the hypoglossal trigone, which includes the nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve, and lateral to the inferior fovea is the vestibular area, or the lower vestibular area, which includes the lower vestibular nuclei for the vestibulocochlear nerve. This is the floor, as we mentioned, the floor of the fourth ventricle, which is formed by the upper part of the medulla, and we will discuss this again in details. The closed medulla, which lies below the open medulla, as you can see, the posterior median sulcus, which divides the floor of the fourth ventricle into two identical halves, continues in the closed medulla as well. So this is the posterior median sulcus. Next to the posterior median sulcus, on either sides, you can find here a nucleus called gracile nucleus. This gracile nucleus is the upward continuation of a tract called gracile tract. So this is gracile tract, and this is the gracile nucleus. Lateral to the gracile tract and the nucleus, you can find another nucleus here, which is the cuneate nucleus and the cuneate tract on each side. So this is the cuneate nucleus and cuneate tract. So the posterior median sulcus, or the posterior median sulcus, divides the lower part of the closed medulla into two halves. On each side of this sulcus, the gracile and cuneate tract, and they expand above to form the gracile and cuneate tubercle, which include the gracile and cuneate nucleus. Now we will discuss the internal features of the medulla oblongata. As you know, the medulla oblongata is the site of emergence of the lower four cranial nerves, which are glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal nerves. So we expect that all of these nuclei are situated inside the medulla oblongata. So the first one is the nucleus ambiguous, which is the nucleus for the cranial nerve, glossopharyngeal, and vagus, and the accessory cranial nerve, cranial part of the cranial accessory. They are collectively known as nucleus ambiguous. The second one is the motor nucleus of the vagus, Also, the inferior salivary nucleus of the glossopharyngeal nerve. Remember that the superior salivary nucleus is present in a level above of the medulla, which is the pons, and this nucleus is formed by the facial nerve, while the inferior salivary nucleus is formed by the glossopharyngeal nerve and is situated in the medulla oblongata. Also, the hypoglossal motor nucleus, the hypoglossal nerve, as you know, supplies the muscles of the tongue. Also, inside the medulla oblongata, you can find the autonomic centers that regulate respiration and circulation and gastrointestinal motility, vital centers. Also, the descending motor pathways, which descend from above downward, as the corticospinal tract. As we said, the corticospinal tract descends in the pyramid of the medulla and cross to the opposite side in the pyramidal decussation. Ascending sensory pathways are also ascending in the medulla oblongata, and don't forget cerebellar pathways, because you know the medulla is connected to the cerebellum by the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and this peduncle contains the cerebellar pathways between the medulla and the cerebellum. Next slides are for the internal levels of the medulla. So you have a level of inferior cerebellar peduncle, and the other one is the level for the decussation of the medial lemnisci, which are the gracile and cuneate tracts. Last one is the level of pyramidal decussation, in which the pyramidal tracts decussate to the opposite side. And of course, these internal levels are not required in details from you. Now we will discuss the fourth ventricle. As we said, the fourth ventricle is the space or the diamond space which lies between the cerebellum posterior and the back of pons and back of upper medulla anterior. So this cavity here in the sagittal section represents the fourth ventricle. This is the cavity between the cerebellum and back of pons, back of open or the upper medulla oblongata. As you can see in the sagittal section, this fourth ventricle continues above through this canal. This canal passes through the midbrain. It's called the cerebral aqueduct. The cerebral aqueduct connects between the fourth ventricle and the third ventricle above. As you know, the third ventricle is the cavity between the two cerebral hemispheres. And in the lower angle, the fourth ventricle continues directly with the spinal canal, which passes through the medulla oblongata and downward continues in the spinal cord. So the upper angle of the fourth ventricle continues through the cerebral aqueduct to the third ventricle and continues downward to the spinal canal inside the spinal cord. The lateral angles are obviously seen in the next slide. We will talk about them in a minute. The roof of the fourth ventricle is formed by the cerebellum and the cerebellar peduncles between the midbrain and the cerebellum. As you know, the midbrain is connected to the cerebellum through this peduncle, which is the superior cerebellar peduncle. And the inferior cerebellar peduncle connects between the medulla oblongata and the cerebellum. The meeting between the superior and inferior cerebellar peduncles on each side of the fourth ventricle. We call it lateral angles, through which you have two foramens, which are called foramens of Luschka. This foramen of Luschka in the cerebrospinal fluid escapes from the floor of the fourth ventricle to the subarachnoid space around the spinal cord and around the brain. So the roof of the fourth ventricle is formed of the cerebellum behind and the superior cerebellar peduncle and the inferior cerebellar peduncle in the superior part and on the inferior part of the roof. Under cover of the superior cerebellar peduncle, you could identify a thin sheet of pia-mater stretched under the superior cerebellar peduncle. It's called superior medullary velum. Another one, which lies here, stretched between the two inferior cerebellar peduncles, which is called the inferior medullary velum. Both superior medullary velum and inferior medullary velum are also sharing in the roof of the fourth ventricle. So if you are talking about the roof of the fourth ventricle, you should remember the superior cerebellar peduncle, which is this green structure here, and the superior medullary velum, which is stretched between the two superior cerebellar peduncles. Also the inferior cerebellar peduncle and the inferior medullary velum, which is stretched between the two inferior cerebellar peduncle. The meeting between the two inferior cerebellar peduncles, you have another foramen here in the center, which is called foramen of Magendie or median foramen. This is the third foramen through which the cerebrospinal fluid escapes from inside the floor of the fourth ventricle to outside the subarachnoid space. So you have three foramens between the floor of the fourth ventricle, or if you want to be accurate, you should say these foramens in the roof of the fourth ventricle. They connect the fourth ventricle to outside the subarachnoid space. Two foramens of Luschka in the lateral angles of the fourth ventricle, and one median aperture or median foramen of Magendie, which lies in the roof between the two inferior cerebellar peduncles. This is the floor of the fourth ventricle. As we mentioned before, it's composed of two parts. And this medullary stria divides the floor of the fourth ventricle into upper part, which is this triangle. This is the back of pons, and lower part, which is the back of upper medulla. The whole thing is called the floor of the fourth ventricle. As you can see, the floor of the fourth ventricle is divided by means of this sulcus. This sulcus is called posterior median sulcus. In the back of pons, you could identify this tubercle, which is called fascial colliculus. As we mentioned before, this fascial colliculus is formed by the nucleus of abducent nerve and the fascial nerve fibers which encircles this nucleus. So this is called fascial colliculus. Above the fascial colliculus, this elevation here is called pyramidal. This elevation is called medial eminence. So the elevation which lies above the fascial colliculus on each side is called medial eminence. In the lower part of the medulla, in the lower part of the floor of the fourth ventricle, which is represented by the open medulla. As we mentioned before, you could identify this depression, which is called the inferior fovea. Between the two limbs of the inferior fovea, here, this triangle represents the vagal trigone. The vagal trigone contain, on each side, contains the nucleus of the vagus nerve. Medial to the inferior fovea, here, this depression or this area is called hypoglossal trigone. So the hypoglossal trigone contains the nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve. Lateral to the inferior fovea, this area here is called lower vestibular area. And the back of bones contain the upper vestibular area, which contain collectively the nuclei for the vestibular nerve. So the vestibular nuclei are included in both back of bones and back of upper medulla. This is the upper vestibular area, which includes half of the vestibular nuclei, and this is the lower vestibular area in the back of medulla, which also includes the lower vestibular nuclei. Don't forget to identify the superficial attachments of the cranial nerves. As we mentioned, the cranial nerves, we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. The first one is the olfactory one. This is the olfactory nerve for the smell sensation, and it emerges directly from the inferior surface of the brain. The second one is the optic nerve, and the optic nerve decussate with the opposite optic nerve in this structure, which is the optic chiasma. And the optic tracts emerge from the optic chiasma and runs backward to surround this area. Sure, this area is the interpeduncular fossa, and we have mentioned the boundaries and contents of the interpeduncular fossa before. So the optic nerve is the second cranial nerve, which emerges directly also from the inferior surface of the brain. The third cranial nerve is the oculomotor nerve. The oculomotor nerves emerge from the interpeduncular fossa from the ventral surface of the midbrain, while the trochlear nerve is the only cranial nerve which emerge from the posterior aspect of the brainstem, and then it winds around the midbrain to come from its anterior surface. So the midbrain is the site for emergence of oculomotor and also the trochlear nerve. This is the pons. This area here is the pons. The pons is the site of emergence of trigeminal nerve. This is the trigeminal nerve, which emerges from the side of the pons. The second one is the abducent nerve. The abducent nerve emerges from the attachment of pons and the pyramid, which is the structure downward here in the medulla oblongata. The facial nerve and vestibulocochlear nerve, they are emerging from the angle between the pons and the medulla oblongata, so that the facial nerve is medial in position. So the trigeminal nerve, the abducent nerve, facial, and vestibulocochlear. Then the medulla oblongata, which is the lower part of the brainstem. Here you could identify the last four cranial nerves. As we mentioned, this structure is the pyramid, and this structure here is the olive. The olive is surrounded by two fissures, the anterolateral fissure, which is this one, and the posterolateral fissure, which is the posterior sulcus, separates between the olive and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The hypoglossal nerve is the cranial nerve which emerges from the anterior median sulcus. This is the hypoglossal nerve, and The glossopharyngeal, vagus, and accessory are the nerves which are emerging from the posterior median sulcus of the medulla oblongata. So these are collectively known as superficial attachments of the 12 cranial nerves. Now we have reached to the end of our online lecture. Next lecture we will describe the anatomy of human cerebellum. Thank you very much.